In recent weeks, developments in the United States may appear at first glance to be isolated and local security incidents. Two fatal interventions involving federal immigration agents in Minneapolis could be interpreted on the surface as routine law enforcement cases. Yet the political, legal, and institutional responses in Washington suggest that these events carry a much broader significance. Quiet administrative decisions, disputes over jurisdiction between states and federal agencies, and ongoing budget negotiations in Congress have pushed these cases beyond the category of local security matters. In this context, what has unfolded in Minneapolis is no longer only a city-level crisis. It has become a focal point in a deeper national debate about how federal power is exercised. In early January, the first fatal incident involving federal immigration agents in Minneapolis was recorded. At the time, public information was limited, and the initial narrative relied largely on official statements. However, a second death on January 24 shifted the trajectory of the story. The circulation of video footage on social media revealed noticeable gaps between official explanations and what appeared to be visible on the ground. These discrepancies raised serious questions not only among the public, but also within the federal judiciary and among members of Congress. Because the timing of these events coincided with critical budget negotiations in Washington, legal and political dimensions quickly became intertwined. On the surface, these developments appear to fit within the broader framework of the Trump administration's long-standing hardline immigration policies. Thousands of federal agents were deployed to Minnesota under an initiative known as Operation Metro Surge, officially justified as a technical effort to combat immigration-related crime and support local law enforcement. In official communications, the operation was presented as a public safety measure designed to enhance enforcement capacity. Yet the scale and methods of the operation soon attracted scrutiny from local governments, civil society groups, and the federal courts. The state of Minnesota, along with the city governments of Minneapolis and St. Paul, initiated legal action, arguing that the operation violated state authority and pushed constitutional boundaries. At this point, the debate moved beyond the effectiveness of a specific security operation. A deeper question emerged. Under what conditions, and within what limits, can the federal government conduct direct operations in the face of explicit objections from local authorities? The answers to this question touch the core of the American federal system. The constitutional structure grants broad powers to the federal government, while also seeking to preserve a degree of autonomy for states and local governments. The developments in Minneapolis have become a concrete example of how this balance functions in practice and where it may be under strain. One of the most significant turning points in this process came with the intervention of the federal judiciary. Federal judges in Minnesota determined that certain ICE detention and transfer practices did not comply with court orders. Chief Judge Patrick Schultz's decision to summon the acting director of ICE to court and to raise the possibility of contempt proceedings marked a rare and serious escalation. Such a move is widely seen as an indication of how strained the relationship between federal agencies and the judiciary has become. While this development may appear, on the surface, as a technical legal procedure, it may carry a deeper meaning. The mismatch between federal agencies' operational practices and judicial rulings suggests that the limits of executive authority are being tested in practice. This is not only a debate about immigration policy. It also reflects a broader process in which the role of federal agencies under judicial oversight is being redefined. At this stage, the first major reframing becomes apparent. What is happening in Minneapolis is no longer simply a series of isolated incidents. It has become a symbolic arena for a wider discussion about the institutional boundaries within which federal power is exercised. This in turn raises questions about how far executive authority can stretch under legal and political scrutiny. On Capitol Hill, these events have further complicated already fragile budget negotiations. Funding for the Department of Homeland Security, and particularly for ICE, has come under intensified examination by Senate Democrats. Some lawmakers are calling for DHS funding to be separated from other appropriations and for stricter oversight conditions to be attached to ICE operations. Republican leadership, meanwhile, has warned that such demands could trigger a crisis leading to a partial government shutdown. At this point, the issue is no longer simply a numerical dispute over budget figures. Congress's power of the purse is increasingly being used as a policy instrument to influence how executive agencies operate in the field. This dynamic suggests that the events in Minneapolis have become a direct lever affecting power balances in Washington. From a strategic perspective, this type of crisis can produce consequences across several dimensions. First, the executive branch's use of federal law enforcement may face more frequent and more forceful legal and political challenges from states. Second, a more assertive role by the judiciary could limit the operational flexibility of federal agencies. Third, Congress's more explicit use of budget authority as a tool of oversight could make friction between the legislative and executive branches more structural and long-lasting. Here, a second reframing comes into focus. The Minneapolis crisis may offer insight not only into present events, but also into longer-term institutional relationships. How federal agencies respond to court rulings could shape the legal framework within which similar operations are conducted in the future. Likewise, funding debates in Congress may influence the future budget structure and operational priorities of DHS and ICE for years to come. These developments point to a broader pattern within the American political system. For a long period, relationships between federal, state, and local levels of government operated within relatively stable boundaries. In recent years, however, rising political polarization and more centralized policy approaches have placed those boundaries under increasing pressure. The events in Minneapolis stand out as a visible example of this structural tension coming to the surface. From an international perspective, there may also be indirect implications. As Washington's political attention and institutional energy are drawn inward, the management of foreign policy priorities can become more complex. At a time of intensified great power competition, internal institutional conflicts may slow decision-making or introduce uncertainty. This can influence how allies and competitors assess the United States' governance capacity and political stability. At a broader systemic level, the developments in Minneapolis provide important signals about how federal power is perceived at the local level. Legal challenges brought by local and state authorities suggest that mechanisms of judicial resistance to federal intervention are becoming more active. This trend may not remain confined to Minnesota. If similar patterns emerge in other states, federal-state relations could enter a period of more structural and sustained tension. In this context, the risk of a government shutdown should not be viewed solely as a technical budgetary issue. It has become a symbolic element of a wider debate about the legitimacy, oversight, and political accountability of federal institutions. The events in Minneapolis now function as a concrete and visible catalyst for that debate. Viewed from above, this crisis reveals a rare and unusually clear three-way friction within the American political system: the simultaneous testing of boundaries between the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. As each institution seeks to defend its own authority, the resulting picture highlights how strained the system's internal balance mechanisms have become. At the same time, it illustrates both the flexibility and the fragility of the American federal structure. Ultimately, the ICE-related incidents in Minneapolis might have remained tragic but localized events. Instead, their timing, the institutional responses, and the surrounding political context have transformed them into part of a much broader narrative. That narrative raises long-term questions about how federal power is exercised, how it is constrained, and how it is held accountable within the political system. Decisions taken by Congress and actions pursued by the courts in the coming weeks will help determine whether this crisis remains a temporary disruption or becomes a more enduring institutional turning point. What is already clear is that the process that began in Minneapolis is likely to continue shaping power dynamics in Washington and testing the resilience of the American political system.